Labour is warning that lives and livelihoods could be at risk if the government doesn't do more to help homeowners whose property has unsafe cladding. They say developers should be given a deadline to remove all combustible material. All of this, of course, in the wake of the tragedy at Grenfell, of course. Let's talk to the Shadow Secretary of State for Housing, Lucy Powell. Good to see you this morning. Look, what exactly do you want to see happen here?
Well, we're going to be calling a vote in Parliament today, an amendment to the Queen's speech, calling on the government to act to save lives and livelihoods. We want to see a deadline now put in place because there's just not been the urgency about this situation. So we want to see a deadline of June 2022 for all dangerous cladding and other materials to be removed from the outside of buildings. That would be 5 years since the Grenfell tragedy. And we also want to see enshrined in legislation protection for leaseholders and others, other residents, from having to pay the cost of this remediation work and removing the dangerous cladding. The government decided not to enshrine that in legislation despite a number of votes in the House of Commons in recent weeks. And now really is the time for them to make absolutely clear that that isn't going to be the case. And just 2 weeks ago, we had a terrible fire in the New Providence Wharf in East London that was covered in the same dangerous cladding that Grenfell Tower was covered in. And really, this should now be a real wake-up call for the government that it's got to act with a much greater sense of urgency.
Yeah, I mean, there is a real problem, isn't there, that people are now sort of own houses that are unsellable, so that they're stuck in their accommodation. But the costs for this are absolutely huge, aren't they? I mean, who's going to pay for it?
Well, the costs are large at the moment. I mean, one of the issues is we don't know to what extent the costs are because the government has not, in this whole last 4 years, actually undertaken a full nationwide audit of which buildings are most at risk with what kind of remediation work that is necessary. So we aren't sure what the costs really are. The government have recently increased the Building Safety Fund to £5 billion, and we welcome that. But there are lots of issues with that fund in terms of the scope, the timetable, and it's being done on a first come, first served basis. But actually, what the government should be doing is doing this full audit of every building like they did in Australia and other places. And then what they should be doing is also going after the developers and the building owners to pay the cost of this remediation work so it doesn't all fall on the taxpayer. But we're also calling for a national task force on this area because the whole system, as you say, is now broken. People can't insure, can't sell their properties. The whole system of risk assessment, of regulation, of oversight is broken and it isn't working. And the government has to lead that process by bringing together a task force of all the players to let's fix this market so that people who've done the right thing in buying their own home and now through no fault of their own are finding themselves on the verge of bankruptcy. And the government have got to act.